Joining me today is a fellow local. We live sort of in the same region, Mark Smith. Mark lives on Victoria's surf coast. He writes young adult stories and fiction, and he also writes short fiction as well. His trilogy, Road to Winter, Wilder Country and Land of Fences, I did actually nearly knock a kid out in a bookshop once saying to them, you must read this, and waving it at their face. They're a fantastic series and highly decorated and loved by readers. And I think if the critics love you and the readers love you, you're doing the right thing. Mark, hello. Nice to speak to you.
Hi, Sue. Thanks for having me.
How did you come to write the trilogy?
I was originally not a young adult writer at all. I was a short fiction writer, and I wrote entirely literary fiction. So all of my short stories were literary fiction, and after I was quite lucky in a lot of ways. I worked very hard at writing short fiction and had about 20 pieces published before I wrote the novels, and won a couple of major competitions with good prize money, and I could have quite happily just kept floating along as a short fiction writer. But I guess the next challenge, and it doesn't always work this way, I know some people don't come via that path, but I came via short fiction to long fiction. And it was, I guess I was looking for what's the next challenge, having written and had quite a number of stories published. And I thought, well, challenge yourself, see if you can have a go at a full-length manuscript. And like a lot of writers, I thought I'd never be able to do that. I would never, I wouldn't have the patience or the diligence to see it through from beginning to end. But I had this idea for a story. I went back through my short stories and I thought, which one of these could I make into a longer narrative? And I seized on this short story, which had never been published. No one liked it. It never had any success as a short story, about a 16-year-old boy named Finn who was surviving in a small coastal town after a pandemic had wiped out most of the population. And that one, I thought, I can do something with that. And that was combined at the same time I was teaching 15-year-old boys and talking a lot with them about what they were reading or what they weren't reading, and trying to getting into their headspace about, well, what do you look for in a novel? What would bring you to reading? And so those two forces combined, and that's when I began to write the manuscript.
Do you think, because sometimes I know I've said to people, there's too much in there for a short story. Do you think it just was a novel and you didn't realise until you came back to it?
That's a really good way of looking at it, and I think so, yeah. The short story ended up being about the first chapter and a half of the novel. And so I think what you need in any piece of writing is a springboard. What's the springboard, and how is that going to get you into the narrative? So I had the springboard. That's why I went back to the short stories. I wasn't creating something from nothing. So I had this springboard, and before I knew it, what had started out as a 2,500 word piece was 10,000 words, and then it was 20,000 words. And I thought, I can actually do this. I think I'll be able to write a full-length manuscript.
Do you think writing or starting with that shorter fiction is a good way to learn the craft?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And I know not everybody does it. I know there are people who have leapt into a novel. For me, I wouldn't have been able to do that. I had to learn my craft. And my first attempt at short stories were appalling. They were terrible. I had enrolled in a short fiction course at Writers Victoria, and I was putting these short stories out everywhere, and I was just getting rejection after rejection after rejection. Reason being that they just weren't that good. But one thing that enrolling in a course does is it highlights your deficiencies as a writer as much as your strengths. So you know what you need to work on. And I soon realised that I wasn't putting in the time and effort, the diligence into those pieces of writing that they needed to get up to publishable standard. So I actually set myself a standard, and the standard was that for a short piece of fiction, I wouldn't submit it until I had done 3 months work on it.
Oh, wow.
So and that's not obviously working on it full time. It's writing a first draft, putting it away, coming back to it, reworking it, turning it around, put it away, come back to it, and over a 3-month period. Because I knew that unless I put that amount of work into it, it just wasn't going to make the grade. It wasn't going to be publishable standard.
What about the book? How long did it take you to write the first one, The Road to Winter?
I foolishly enrolled in a course at Writers Victoria called A Novel in a Year. And I did that though. I wrote a first draft in 12 months. And I was working full time and I had a family, doing all the other social things as well. But I'd set myself, and I actually finished it. Believe it or not, I finished it on the 31st of December. I was so determined to get through that draft. I wanted to have one done. And then I took another 6 months from the raw manuscript to develop it into something that I thought was submissible.
When did you know it was going to be a trilogy?
That's a really good, I think it was when I was sitting in the office at Text, who loved the first manuscript. And it was a complete standalone story, the first book. And they said, "This is fantastic. We would like to offer you a 3-book deal. Can you write 3? Can you turn this into a trilogy?" And without thinking, without batting an eye, I said, "Yeah, sure, not a problem." And that's when it became a trilogy. And literally on the spot in that meeting at the publisher, when they put this offer on the table, I made up basically the story for the second book.
I'm so glad someone else does that, because you're so excited that they love your work. You just go,
Yeah.
"Sure, yep." And you start talking and half of your brain's going, "Stop now, stop. You haven't thought about this."
Yeah. Well, strangely enough, the narrative that I made up on the spot in that meeting was pretty close to the way the second book turned out. So
Wow.
I must, maybe subconsciously, I was already thinking about that, about where this story might be able to go from here.
Did you find it? A lot of people talk about the second novel syndrome, where it's hard to write and hard to do. Did you
Yeah.
experience that, or because you knew Finn, were you able just to keep going?
I think the way I'm looking at that at the moment is I feel as though I'm writing my second novel now. Because I'm writing a 4th book, but it's totally different. It's still young adult, but it's totally different. I felt as though when I was writing Wilder Country, the second book in the trilogy, that I was just continuing to write the same book, and I did that 3 times over. So as you say, I had the voice, I had the characters, I had to bring in a few new characters, obviously, change the setting a little bit. It had to progress, the narrative had to progress, but I was pretty much writing the same story. And going back to scratch again, I think, is where the second book syndrome comes in. And that's where I felt I was. I've got a first draft now of a new book, and that's, so I'm past it. But I can understand where, especially a first-time author who has one book published and then coming to their second one with that weight of expectation on their shoulders, how they could find that really daunting.
Oh, and especially too when yours have been so loved and celebrated, as I said, critically and by readers. So, no pressure at all. It makes it
Well,
hard.
the biggest pressure was that with The Road to Winter, Text put a money-back guarantee on the cover. They said, if you don't like this book, you can. And there was a little tear-out section in the back that you could send back to Text, and they would give you your money back.
And did any come back? Do you know?
Not that I'm aware of.
Wow.
I think though, once it started getting onto school curriculums, they took that page off the back. Out of the back.
Yeah, you'd have had the hundreds then. You know what they're like when you've got to read them. I had a little boy come in with his grandmother, about 13, when I was working in the bookshop, and I said to him, "Read this, dead set. You will love it. And if you love it, there's 2 more there. Oh no, the 3rd one wasn't out. The 2nd one's there. But I'm telling you, you'll love it, and I'll buy it back from you if you don't love it." I thought, "Oh God, them's fighting words." Anyway, the next day he came back in with his grandmother, and I went, "Uh-oh," and he said, "Okay, I'll have the other one." I went, "Yes." He read it in a night. So
fantastic. Yeah.
which is
I always love hearing those stories, because even though that's kind of 2.5 years of your life has gone into that book, and someone's read it overnight, but that's fantastic.
Yeah, it is. It's just that they couldn't put it down. That's what you aim for. Let's talk about just the setting before we get on to, your writing processes and things. It is so much a character, I think, in the three books. And living around here and having lived in Coal Lake, I'm going, hey, I know where you are now. I know where they are. I really love that. How important was it for you to get that sense of place in those novels?
It was critical. I'm really pleased that you used that description that the setting is like a character, because that's what I was aiming for. I'm probably unlike a lot of other writers. I actually begin with setting, and I think if I find the setting, I'll find the character, rather than the other way around. So that setting, which is so natural and obvious to me, is the place that I live, the place that I love. And and you're a teacher as well, so in those writing workshops where you keep telling those kids, write what you're passionate about, write what you know, and that's a really good demonstration of that, because it's not just the setting. The setting is not something that's in the background. The setting is something that those characters are interacting with the whole time, and it's actually the setting which is bringing out more of their character and helping to develop their character as they move through that countryside, when he's in the water, on the beach, in the forest, whatever it might be.
Yeah, no, I've really enjoyed that part of it. Clearly, I like the books, in case you haven't noticed. So you started with short fiction. You're writing young adult fiction now. Do you feel, because there can be a danger that people get pigeonholed into, oh, you are a writer.
Mm.
Are you aware of that? Does it worry you?
I am aware of it, and I've basically got two manuscripts going at the same time at the moment, and one is an adult manuscript which I've had for a little while and I've been sort of pottering away on. I do feel there's a certain amount of frustration in being a YA writer, because I don't think we are given the sort of credence we deserve as writers in the literary community. And it's almost as though you're not a real writer until you've written an adult book, And if there are more people who wrote, literary fiction that came and tried to write for young adults, I think they'd realise the difficulty of it. For me, writing is writing is writing. And whether that's literary fiction, short stories, or whether it's romance, or whether it's YA, I think a writer should be able to move between what we call genres, and do that quite comfortably. However, publishers see that in a very different light, because publishers are there to market. They're a business, and that idea of establishing you as a YA writer or as a writer in a particular genre is important to them, because they know they might get 2 or 3 books out of you for that one investment of establishing you in that genre.
Yep.
And I really admire writers who don't accept that, who slip so easily between genres. And it's something that I'm very keen to do as well. And I was a literary fiction writer anyway, with short stories, and then now I've written, this will be my 4th young adult novel, and I will try to do something different next.
Yeah. What do you like about young adult novels, being a young adult writer?
So many things. It is number one for me is the audience, and there's I think there's this sort of impression in the wider community that that's not a critical audience, but I think it's an incredibly critical audience. It is a very difficult audience to write for. There are so many things going on in young people's lives, especially like young adult, if we're talking sort of 14 plus, 13 plus. Think of all the things that are happening in those people's lives, those kids' lives, young adults' lives. And here you are trying to put this book in front of them and engage them long enough to actually get through it and go with the characters and actually love what you are writing, while their screens are beckoning and their friends are beckoning and social media is beckoning and all of those other things are going on in their lives. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen with adult readership, but given the sometimes the relatively short attention span of kids as well. It just makes it a harder thing to do, and therefore I think more rewarding when you do get something that finds purchase among those readers. And for me, I'm a lifelong educator. I've been that was my job for my entire life. So to see my books in schools and being picked up and put on curriculum, and now having the great pleasure and opportunity of being able to go into those schools and to discuss these stories that these kids are engaged with them, it's a privilege. It's an absolute privilege. That's what I like most about it. There are lots of other things that I can sort of take or leave, but that for me is the overriding beauty of writing for young adults.
Do you find there are any limitations in being a YA writer?
Only limitations that other people put on you, I think. I think that we have seen it in the time that I've been writing young adult, which has only been for the last 5 years. I think there have been leaps and bounds, huge leaps and bounds made in what's being accepted as young adult writing now. And I think if you look at, I've just not that long ago finished Holden Shepherd's book, Invisible Boys. Now I think that even 5 or 6 years ago, I don't know whether that would have got a foothold in the young adult market, but it's there now, and I think that we're beginning to progress in this genre in a way that that we've been slow to do in the past. I think it's opening up more, which is fantastic. The fact that we have greater diversity now among our writers, our readers, I think that's been huge, and I think YA has actually led the field.
I do too. I think so. And do you know what else I think's really happened in the last little while? Probably 5-10 years is, and this might be unfair, but I think the readers are so much more respected now. I don't think they were respected enough earlier. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I would agree. Yeah, and you've been in it longer than I have, and I've been dropped into, I've parachuted into the middle of what was happening in about 2016, and it's been a very steep learning curve. But even in that short time, I can see the changes that have taken place.
No, it's a good thing. How do you write? Are you a computer writer or a hand writer?
Definitely a computer writer, but I have notebooks. And it's the first thing that I say to students when I'm teaching in workshops is, if you're going to be a writer, you've got to be observant, and not just be observant, but you've got to be taking all of that stuff down. You can't hold it in here because it'll be gone. Yep. So whether it's on your phone, whether it's in notebooks, wherever it is, on the back of your hand, whatever, listen, observe, watch. Take on board all of those things that are happening around you, and don't let them slip. Hang on to them, because you can use them in a story somewhere.
Everything's fodder, and you don't know when it's going to pop up. You'll be writing and go, oh, and you go, oh, that happened 10 years ago, and here I am writing it.
Yes, that's right. Yeah,
it's good.
And I think kids in particular have a pretty strange idea about what writers do and how writers operate. I like the idea of breaking that mold and saying, I use a lot of what I call writing away from the desk. And that is, when I'm out surfing, or I'm riding a mountain bike, or I'm walking the dog, or whatever, it's all these ideas ticking over and ticking over and ticking over, and not letting go of them, but coming back, jotting them down, because you'll be able to use them somewhere. So it is, there's so many aspects to being a writer, and you don't even. I've only in the last, I wasn't a reader as a teenager. I wasn't a reader at all. I wasn't remotely interested in reading. Someone had told me when I was 15 that I was going to be an author, I would have laughed. I wasn't even a reader, let alone a writer.
What about as a younger child, like at primary school? Did you read then? Because quite often, as you know, boys get to 12, 13 and go, yeah, that'll do with reading.
Yeah. No, I was a total outdoors boy. So I knew how to read. I knew the mechanics of reading. I just wasn't remotely interested. And it wasn't until I was about 15 when I had a bad spinal injury. that I spent a lot of time indoors, and I had to find something as a means of escape, and that's when reading started to become important.
Do you remember what that first book was that you went, oh, this is what they're talking about?
Doesn't everybody?
Yeah.
Look, there were a couple, and they'll seem like very different books, but Storm Boy was one of them. And we mentioned landscape before, and we mentioned setting, and that was the first book that I read that had put into words what I felt when I was outdoors. I said I was an outdoors boy, and that's set in the Coorong and that beautiful environment. And I engaged as much with the environment in that book as I did with the characters. And again, it'll seem like a bit of a leap, but I Catcher in the Rye for me was because I was 15 and I still didn't understand totally what a lot of it was about, but it changed my understanding of what a book could be.
Have you read it recently?
No, I haven't gone back, and I'm almost a little bit afraid to.
No, do. I went back. I wasn't going to, because we had to read it in Form 5, and I was sort of like, I'm being cool going, yeah, God, this is boring. I loved it. And then recently, I think my husband and I were talking about it, and I grabbed it and read it and went, oh, it's even better. Especially being a YA writer. Oh, hell, it's good. Yeah, you won't be disappointed at all. What are you reading at the moment? I know you've just finished one.
I'm on a Tasmanian bent at the moment. I'm reading the Truganini.
What's it like?
It is fantastic.
It's on my list.
It's a really great piece of work, and we have that. I was a history teacher as well, and we had this idea, that sort of Truganini was this footnote of Australian history, the supposed last Tasmanian, and this brings her to life, and she's just the most incredible character, and it's very well written, and I'd heartily recommend it.
Right. I'll pop that on because it isn't a very big list at all. I've just started Bruni, which also is sort of...
okay, yes. So, yeah.
Yes.
Well, Truganini, her country is Bruni Island. That's where she came from.
Yeah, fantastic. So are you still teaching, or are you full-time writing?
No, I'm full-time writing, though during lockdown, that's there's not much. I like you, I do a lot of work in schools, and that's something which is now not happening nearly as much. We're doing some online stuff, and pre-recorded stuff, but it's very different. It's a little bit, it's very different to being in front of a class, being in front of a group, and it's like where you're reading that audience, you're knowing who you need to play to, and how you need to just change up what you're speaking about, or where to direct it, when to throw in the jokes, and when to challenge them a little bit. All of that stuff that's instinctive to teaching with a live audience is more difficult to do online. But then again, I get to do it. I get to just walk into my room here and go to work, which has lots of benefits when you live relatively remotely from a lot of the schools that we work at.
Yeah, it is. It's strange because at home you sort of feel more comfortable, but in the classroom I feed off their energy, I love, that's the one thing about not teaching anymore. I do miss the kids. I miss that relationship.
I think so. You've really nailed something there as well. And one of the huge benefits of being a teacher when you're an author, because you have that experience, you know what it's like to be in front of a class, you know how to read a room, all of those things that are just instinctive, that you don't even have to think about, as opposed to someone who's come to writing and become an author from somewhere else, hasn't had that experience, and find those presentation skills a lot more difficult.
Yeah. And for us to add the discipline side of it's that bit easier, because I can still throw a good teacher greasy.
Oh, yeah.
It's all you have to do. I had other fellow writers say, what'd you do? I said, oh, don't you worry, just a little secret.
That's right. Yeah.
So your new work, are you happy to talk about generally what you're doing with the YA?
It's it revolves around it's a small coastal town where a coal mine and power station have been operating, and it sort of links in with the climate strikes with school kids, and a campaign that takes place in this town and divides the town down the middle.
Sounds great.
And with the campaign that happens, so it's you know what it's like when you've got a first draft. You're thinking it's just this amorphous lump, you know, that you have to start moulding now, and I'm doing a lot of editing, a lot of cutting out. But I do tend to be a writer who writes more than I need, and then I cut back. So you know,
Yeah, I'd rather cut.
Yeah, my first novel, The Road to Winter, the original manuscript was 90,000 words. Wow. And it was published at 58,000 words. Yeah. So there was a lot taken out of it. This one I'm at about 75, and it will probably be published at about 60, probably. So this is a lot of cut. I'm not sure where that cutting's going to happen yet, but it will.
Yeah. But isn't it funny when you do start it? Because I love editing. I love writing, but editing is magic. But when you start editing, it's glaringly obvious. You go, oh, well, that can go. Or it's funny how it works.
Yeah. But I like that idea of having words in the bank as well, because it allows you to be brutal. So if you know an entire scene, you lose. If you think, you realise, oh, that scene doesn't work. You know, you can cut out. That could be a couple of thousand words, and you can just do it like that, and it's not going to affect the you know, the body of the work. So I think that's really important. And again, it's something else that I say to kids. You know, if you've got a 1,500 word piece that you're going to hand in, write 2,000 words and pare back. It's a lot easier doing it that way than trying to build it up.
Oh, absolutely. No one wants to pad. Now, last question. Well, I've got 1,000 more I could ask you, but last question is, now, the trilogy is about a pandemic, and the world goes nutty. We're currently living through one. Are there areas of what we're living through that you went, God, I didn't think that'd happen?
Well, there are so many things that were predicted in the book. I didn't predict the run on toilet paper. I was a little bit disappointed about that. But there was looting. There's looting in supermarkets. There were quarantined areas. There were lockdowns. There were closed borders. So I didn't want those things to happen. But the other thing is, Sue, that's, you know, this is not unprecedented. The times that we're in are not unprecedented. There've been, you know, a lot of people have spoken already about the Spanish flu and the effects of that after the First World War. And it didn't take a lot to extrapolate. I guess for me, I would never have thought of the severity of what we're actually living through in the 21st century, you know, in this last year. But it didn't seem a huge leap to be. It's the great thing about writing dystopian, you know, you can take an existing situation and just ratchet it up 2 or 3 notches so that it's at that point of being, maybe that could actually happen, you know.
Yeah.
And that's, and it didn't take much to get to that point.
Exactly. Yeah, and I'm with you. When the whole toilet paper thing was happening, I was going, why? Why toilet paper? That's
Go figure.
Very, very strange. It's been delightful to talk to you. Thank you for sharing your time with me. I'll let you go and get back to your afternoon. Thanks, Mark Smith. Really appreciate it.
That's a pleasure, Sue. Thanks very much for having me.